At the family reunion, my daughter-in-law smirked. "No one here loves you. You're a burden." They clapped. I kept calm. Then my granddaughter stood, raised her tablet, and read a sentence that silenced every guest. My daughter-in-law's face collapsed when Victoria began reading the letter from Le Bernardin restaurant. But let me start from the beginning, because the pain didn't begin that night. It had been building for 3 years, ever since Stephanie married my son Michael, and decided that everything I represented was an embarrassment to her vision of a modern family. I'm Linda Morrison, 72 years old, and I've spent my entire life believing that food was love made visible. For 50 years, I poured my heart into every dish I created, every family gathering I organized, every tradition I carefully preserved and passed down. My kitchen was the heart of our family, where birthdays were celebrated, holidays were honored, and memories were made one meal at a time. My late husband Robert used to say I had magic in my hands. When our children were small, neighbors would smell my Sunday roasts from 3 houses away. I created recipes that became family legends. My grandmother's Italian sauce that I perfected over decades, the Christmas cookies that made my grandchildren's eyes light up, the Thanksgiving stuffing that had guests asking for the recipe every single year. After Robert passed 5 years ago, cooking became my lifeline.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
It was how I stayed connected to our family, how I showed love when words felt inadequate. Every Sunday, 23 people would gather around my dining room table. Children, grandchildren, in-laws, and friends, all brought together by the meals I spent days preparing with the same care I'd always given. Then Stephanie entered our lives. At first, she seemed impressed by the family traditions. She'd compliment my cooking, ask questions about recipes, and even helped serve during our gatherings. I thought she genuinely wanted to learn, to become part of our family's culinary heritage. I was so naive. The changes started small. Stephanie would suggest updating some of my recipes, adding trendy ingredients or modern techniques. When I politely declined, she'd smile and say she understood, but I caught the look in her eyes, the same look she gave Robert's old furniture before convincing Michael to replace it all. Then came the comments about my old-fashioned ways. During family dinners, she'd laugh about how I insisted on making everything from scratch, calling it so vintage, in a tone that made it sound like a character flaw. She'd bring store-bought desserts to supplement my homemade ones, explaining to everyone that people expect more variety these days. 6 months after their wedding, Stephanie started hosting casual get-togethers at her and Michael's house. Small affairs, she claimed, just for the younger generation who wanted something more relaxed than my formal Sunday dinners. I wasn't invited to these gatherings, but I heard about them afterward, how much fun everyone had, how refreshing it was to have pizza delivered instead of spending hours cooking. The Sunday dinners began shrinking. First, Michael's brother stopped coming, claiming he was too busy with work. Then my daughter Sarah started missing every other week, citing her children's soccer schedules. One by one, my table grew emptier while Stephanie's casual gatherings grew larger. I tried to adapt. I offered to make the meals simpler, less formal. I suggested potluck-style dinners where everyone could contribute, but Stephanie had a counter-suggestion for everything, always delivered with that sweet smile that never reached her eyes. "Maybe we should take a break from the big family meals," she'd say. "People are so busy these days. Maybe it's time to let the tradition evolve." Evolve. That was her favorite word. Everything about our family needed to evolve, according to Stephanie. The recipes I'd perfected over decades were too heavy for modern palates. The china that had been in our family for 3 generations was too formal for casual dining. Even the way I set the table was apparently outdated. The breaking point came last Christmas. I had spent 3 weeks preparing for our traditional celebration, the same menu I'd been making for 40 years, the same decorations that had graced our table since my children were small. I'd stayed up until midnight on Christmas Eve, putting the finishing touches on my famous tiramisu, the dessert that had ended every Christmas dinner for as long as anyone could remember. When the family arrived on Christmas Day, Stephanie walked in carrying a store-bought cheesecake. "I thought we'd try something different this year," she announced brightly. "This is from that new French bakery downtown, much more sophisticated than traditional Christmas desserts." I watched in silence as my tiramisu, The dessert I'd been perfecting since before Stephanie was born sat untouched on the counter while everyone raved about the store-bought cheesecake. My granddaughter Victoria, then 15, was the only one who asked for a slice of my tiramisu. Even she could only manage a few bites before Stephanie distracted her with talk about the French bakery's authentic techniques. After that Christmas, the invitations to family gatherings became sporadic. Stephanie would plan events and forget to call me until the last minute, or she'd schedule them during times when she knew I had other commitments. When I did attend, I felt like a guest in my own family, watching Stephanie orchestrate celebrations that bore no resemblance to the traditions I'd spent decades building. The recipes I'd carefully written down and planned to pass to my grandchildren remained in my kitchen, unused and unappreciated. The stories behind each dish, how I'd learned my mother's bread recipe during the Depression, how I'd created my signature pasta sauce during Robert's long recovery from surgery, how each family recipe carried the weight of our history, were dismissed as old stories that no one wanted to hear anymore. My role as the family's culinary heart was systematically erased, replaced by Stephanie's vision of modern entertaining. Catered affairs replaced home-cooked meals. Restaurant reservations replaced kitchen gatherings. The sacred act of cooking for the people you love was reduced to an inconvenience, a relic of a less sophisticated time. But what hurt most wasn't the loss of my recipes or even my role in family celebrations. It was watching my family forget what those traditions had meant, seeing them accept Stephanie's narrative that progress meant abandoning everything that had come before. They stopped asking about family recipes. They stopped sharing memories of past celebrations. They stopped seeing food as anything more than fuel. I began to feel invisible in my own family, a reminder of outdated ways that embarrassed Stephanie's modern sensibilities. Every gathering became an exercise in diminishment, where my contributions were politely acknowledged and quickly overshadowed by whatever new trend Stephanie had discovered. Tonight's family reunion was supposed to be my chance to reconnect with everyone, to show them that the old ways still had value. I'd spent days preparing my signature dishes, hoping to remind them of the love that had always brought us together around the dinner table. Instead, I found myself facing the most humiliating moment of my 72 years, as my daughter-in-law stood before my entire family and declared that I was nothing more than a burden they all had to endure. But Victoria was about to change everything with a single sentence from her tablet, and Stephanie's carefully constructed narrative was about to crumble under the weight of the truth she'd been hiding. The banquet hall felt different tonight. Instead of the warm, intimate gatherings I'd hosted for decades in my own home, Stephanie had insisted on renting this sterile venue for our annual family reunion. Everything about it screamed modern sophistication, from the minimalist white tables to the hired catering staff who served bland, artfully plated portions that looked beautiful but tasted like nothing. I sat at the far end of the main table, pushed to the periphery like an unwelcome afterthought. Stephanie held court at the center, regaling everyone with stories about their recent vacation to Napa Valley and their plans to renovate their kitchen with professional-grade equipment. She spoke about food like it was a lifestyle accessory, not the foundation of family connection I'd always believed it to be. My grandson Tyler, now 21, barely acknowledged my presence when he arrived. There was a time when he'd burst through my kitchen door every Sunday, begging for my homemade garlic bread and sneaking tastes of whatever I was preparing. Tonight, he was more interested in the craft cocktails Stephanie had arranged than in reconnecting with his grandmother. Grandma Linda's food was always so heavy, I heard him tell his cousin Emma. All that butter and cream. Stephanie's shown us so many healthier options. Did you try those quinoa appetizers? They're amazing. I watched my family feast on the catered meal, salmon that had no soul, vegetables that had never seen a grandmother's careful seasoning, desserts that came from a factory instead of a heart full of love. They complimented everything enthusiastically, as if they'd forgotten what real food was supposed to taste like. Sarah, my youngest daughter, caught my eye and offered an apologetic smile. She'd been the most resistant to Stephanie's changes, still calling me occasionally to ask for recipe advice. But even she seemed caught up in the evening's atmosphere, laughing at Stephanie's jokes about outdated cooking methods, and nodding along when the conversation turned to the convenience of meal delivery services. "It's so much more efficient," Stephanie was saying. her voice carrying across the table with practiced confidence. Why spend entire days cooking when you can get restaurant-quality meals delivered right to your door? Women today have so many better things to do with their time than being chained to a stove. Chained to a stove. As if the 50 years I'd spent creating meals for this family had been some kind of servitude instead of the greatest joy of my life. As if every recipe I'd perfected, every tradition I'd maintained, every moment of love I'd poured into feeding the people I cherished had been nothing more than wasted time. Michael nodded enthusiastically at his wife's words. My own son, who used to sit on the kitchen counter as a child, begging to help me stir sauces and roll out dough, now seemed embarrassed by the very idea of home cooking. When had I lost him so completely? When had he stopped seeing the kitchen as the heart of our family and started viewing it as Stephanie did, an inconvenient relic of the past? The conversation shifted to their latest dinner party, which they'd hosted the previous weekend. I hadn't been invited, of course. According to Stephanie, it had been a sophisticated affair, with a professional chef who'd prepared a 7-course tasting menu. Each dish was a work of art, she gushed. The presentation was absolutely stunning. Nothing like those old casseroles and roasts we grew up with. People expect so much more now. Dining has become an experience, not just about filling your stomach. Old casseroles and roasts. She was talking about the meals that had sustained this family through decades of celebrations, sorrows, and ordinary Tuesday nights. The beef stew I'd made when Michael had pneumonia as a teenager, sitting by his bedside with a thermos of broth until his fever broke. The birthday cakes I'd stayed up all night decorating, creating edible masterpieces that made my grandchildren squeal with delight. The holiday meals that had required days of preparation, but brought 3 generations together around one table. "Grandma Linda, you're so quiet tonight," Emma called out from across the table. At 19, she was one of the few family members who still treated me with genuine warmth. "Are you feeling okay?" Before I could answer, Stephanie jumped in with her characteristic sweetness that always felt like poison wrapped in honey. "Oh, I think Linda's just feeling a bit overwhelmed by all the excitement. These big gatherings can be a lot for someone her age." Someone her age. As if 72 meant I was incapable of handling a simple family dinner. As if the woman who had organized countless family gatherings, coordinated holiday meals for 25 people, and managed every detail of our celebrations for half a century, was now too frail to cope with a catered event. "Actually," I said, finding my voice despite the knot in my throat, "I was just thinking about all the family reunions we used to have. Remember when we'd spend weeks planning the menu together? Everyone would contribute their favorite dishes, and we'd try new recipes alongside the traditional ones." The table fell silent for a moment. I could see flickers of recognition in some faces. Memories of gatherings where the food had been prepared with love instead of hired out to strangers, where the kitchen had buzzed with activity and laughter as multiple generations worked side by side. But Stephanie quickly filled the uncomfortable silence. "Those were different times," she said with a dismissive laugh, "before people understood nutrition and presentation. Before we realized that spending days in the kitchen was really just another form of women's oppression disguised as tradition. Women's oppression. She'd managed to turn my life's work, my greatest source of pride and joy, into a political statement about gender inequality. According to Stephanie's worldview, every meal I'd lovingly prepared, every tradition I'd carefully preserved, every moment I'd spent nourishing my family had actually been an act of self-subjugation. I felt something break inside me at those words. Not just my heart, though that was certainly shattered. Something deeper. My sense of place in this family. My understanding of my own worth, my belief that the love I'd poured into feeding these people had mattered at all. "The truth is," Stephanie continued, her voice gaining momentum as she sensed the table's attention, "holding on to these old-fashioned traditions just holds everyone back. Food is about fuel and nutrition now, not some sentimental attachment to the past. We need to move forward, not cling to outdated ways of doing things." She looked directly at me when she said it, and I saw something cold and calculating in her eyes. This wasn't just about cooking or tradition. This was about erasing me entirely, removing every trace of my influence from the family so she could rebuild it in her own image. "Take Victoria, for example," Stephanie said, gesturing toward my 16-year-old granddaughter, who had been unusually quiet all evening. "She's learning to appreciate quality cuisine now. Just last week, I took her to that new molecular gastronomy restaurant downtown. The way they transform simple ingredients into artistic presentations is absolutely fascinating. Much more educational than watching someone follow the same old recipes over and over again. Victoria looked uncomfortable at being singled out, her eyes darting between Stephanie and me. She'd always been my closest ally among the grandchildren, the one who still asked to help in the kitchen, who remembered the stories behind each family recipe. But even she seemed caught between two worlds now, Stephanie's sophisticated future and my supposedly obsolete past. I wanted to speak up, to defend the traditions that had meant everything to me, to remind everyone of the love and history embedded in every dish I'd ever prepared for them. But the words wouldn't come. How could I explain that food had never been just about fuel for me? How could I make them understand that every meal had been a prayer, every recipe a love letter, every gathering a sacred ritual that connected us across generations? Instead, I sat in silence as Stephanie continued her monologue about the evolution of dining culture, feeling more invisible with each passing minute. My family nodded and laughed at appropriate moments, fully invested in her vision of their culinary future, a future that apparently had no place for me or anything I represented. The hired servers began clearing the plates, their efficient movements a stark contrast to the way my family used to linger over meals, savoring both the food and each other's company. Everything about tonight felt rushed, impersonal, designed for appearance rather than connection. As the evening wore on, I found myself studying the faces around the table. These people I'd spent my life loving and nourishing, who now seemed like strangers. When had they stopped seeing me as the family's heart and started viewing me as an embarrassment to be managed? When had my traditions become burdens instead of blessings? But I noticed Victoria watching me throughout Stephanie's performance, her expression troubled. Unlike the others, she didn't seem entirely convinced by her aunt's arguments. Several times I caught her glancing at her phone, her fingers moving quickly across the screen as if she was searching for something. Whatever she was looking for, I had a feeling it was about to change everything. The servers had cleared the main course, and I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment away from Stephanie's relentless commentary about modern dining culture. As I walked past the other tables in the banquet hall, I could hear fragments of conversations from other families gathered for their own celebrations, normal families who still seemed to enjoy each other's company, who laughed together without the undercurrent of judgment that had poisoned our gathering. In the mirror above the bathroom sink, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. When had I become so diminished? The confident matriarch who had once commanded respect in her own kitchen had been replaced by this uncertain, apologetic figure who felt like an intruder at her own family reunion. I thought back to the woman I used to be, before Stephanie entered our lives and convinced everyone that my way of loving them was wrong. I remembered the Sunday mornings when my house would fill with the sounds of multiple generations working together, children learning to roll meatballs while their parents caught up on the week's events, teenagers complaining about having to help, but secretly proud when their contributions were praised. Those mornings had been pure magic. The kitchen would be chaos, flour everywhere, multiple pots bubbling on the stove, the sweet smell of rising bread mixing with the savory aroma of slow-simmering sauces. But it was beautiful chaos, the kind that only happens when people who love each other create something together. Robert used to joke that our Sunday kitchen looked like a small army was preparing for battle. He wasn't wrong. Feeding 23 people required military precision, but also the kind of intuitive teamwork that only comes from years of practice. Everyone knew their role. Sarah would handle the salads while Michael managed the wine. The older grandchildren would set the table while the younger ones were tasked with arranging flowers or folding napkins. Now those same grandchildren barely looked up from their phones long enough to acknowledge my presence. They'd learned from Stephanie that my traditions were antiquated, that the skills I'd tried to pass down to them were irrelevant in their modern world. But I remembered when Tyler was 8 years old, standing on a step stool beside me as I taught him to make my grandmother's meatballs. His small hands had struggled with the mixing, and he'd gotten meat under his fingernails, but his face had glowed with pride when I told him he was a natural chef. "Will you teach me all your recipes, Grandma?" he'd asked, "so I can make them for my kids someday?" That boy was now 21, and couldn't be bothered to spend 5 minutes talking to me about anything more substantial than the weather. According to him, my cooking was too heavy, too old-fashioned, Too much work for modern people who had better things to do with their time. When had better things to do become more important than maintaining the connections that held families together? When had convenience become more valuable than the satisfaction of creating something beautiful with your own hands? I splashed cold water on my face and tried to compose myself before returning to the table. The dessert course would be served soon. Some elaborate confection from an expensive bakery that would probably be beautiful and tasteless. Nothing like the desserts I used to make that were imperfect in appearance, but rich with the flavors of real butter, real vanilla, real love. As I walked back to my seat, I noticed Victoria had moved to sit closer to where I'd been. She was still focused on her phone, but there was an intensity to her concentration that made me curious. When I sat down, she looked up and gave me a small, secretive smile that reminded me of the little girl who used to sneak into my kitchen to steal cookie dough. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" I whispered, not wanting to draw Stephanie's attention to our conversation. Victoria nodded but didn't elaborate. Instead, she showed me her phone screen briefly, just long enough for me to see that she was reading something, though I couldn't make out the details. Whatever it was, it seemed to be absorbing all of her attention. The dessert arrived with great fanfare. The servers presented individual chocolate sculptures that looked more like art installations than food. Stephanie immediately began photographing hers from multiple angles, explaining to everyone how the dessert incorporated molecular techniques and innovative flavor profiles. I took a small bite of mine. It was technically impressive, I supposed, but it tasted like expensive air. There was no soul in it, no story, no connection to anything meaningful. It was food as performance rather than nourishment, style over substance in the most literal sense. "Isn't it incredible?" Stephanie gushed. "The pastry chef trained in Paris. You can really taste the difference when someone has proper culinary education rather than just following old family recipes." Old family recipes. She said it like they were some kind of disease, a contamination that needed to be eliminated from modern kitchens. Never mind that those recipes had been refined over generations, adjusted and perfected through decades of trial and error, passed down from mothers to daughters as precious inheritance. "I remember when dessert meant something different," I said quietly, not really intending for anyone to hear me. But Stephanie's hearing was excellent when it came to detecting any challenge to her authority. "Oh, what do you mean by that, Linda?" she asked with false sweetness. I hesitated, knowing I was walking into dangerous territory. But something about the artificiality of the evening, the complete erasure of everything I'd spent my life building, made me reckless. I meant dessert used to be about celebration, not just showing off. The birthday cakes that took me all day to decorate because I wanted them to be perfect for whichever grandchild was turning another year older. The apple pies I'd make when someone needed comfort. The Christmas cookies we'd bake together as a family. Everyone getting flour in their hair and laughing at the misshapen ones. The table had gone quiet. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in Michael's eyes, a memory of those Christmas cookie marathons when he was young and would eat half the dough before we could get it in the oven. But Stephanie quickly filled the silence. "Well, that's a lovely sentiment, Linda, but let's be honest. Those homemade desserts were usually pretty amateur compared to what professional pastry chefs can create. And the time investment was just unrealistic. Modern families need efficient solutions that don't require someone to spend their entire day in the kitchen. Amateur." She'd called my desserts amateur. The birthday cakes that had made my grandchildren squeal with joy. The holiday cookies that had been requested by name for decades. The pies that had won blue ribbons at the county fair. All dismissed as amateur efforts by someone who thought hiring a professional was inherently superior to making something yourself. "There's nothing wrong with appreciating professional quality," Stephanie continued, warming to her theme. "It's actually more respectful to the culinary arts to recognize when experts can do something better than we can at home. Not everyone needs to be a cook, just like not everyone needs to be a carpenter or a mechanic." She was comparing my cooking to manual labor, reducing 50 years of culinary passion to the same category as changing oil or fixing a leaky faucet, as if the art I'd spent my lifetime perfecting was just another household chore that could be outsourced to professionals. "Besides," she added, "people's palates are much more sophisticated now. They can appreciate subtle flavors and innovative techniques that weren't even possible in home kitchens back in the day. It's really about evolving with the times rather than clinging to outdated methods." There it was again. that word evolving. In Stephanie's vocabulary, evolution meant abandoning everything that had come before, discarding tradition in favor of whatever was newest and most expensive. There was no room in her vision of progress for the wisdom that came from experience, no value placed on the knowledge that had been accumulated over generations. I wanted to tell her that sophistication wasn't about molecular techniques or unusual ingredients. It was about understanding how to comfort someone with food when words weren't enough. It was about knowing exactly which dessert would make a troubled grandchild smile, or how to adjust a recipe based on who would be eating it. It was about the love that transformed simple ingredients into something that nourished both body and soul. But I could see from the faces around the table that Stephanie had already won this argument in their minds. They nodded along with her assessment of modern culinary evolution, seemingly convinced that their grandmother's cooking had been holding them back from some higher form of gastronomic enlightenment. Only Victoria seemed unmoved by Stephanie's speech. She was still focused on her phone, scrolling through whatever she'd been reading with increasing intensity. Several times, she glanced up at Stephanie with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and suspicion. As the evening wound down and family members began discussing their departure plans, I felt the familiar weight of disappointment settling over me. Another gathering where I'd been made to feel like a relic. Another evening where Stephanie had successfully positioned herself as the voice of progress, while painting me as an obstacle to the family's advancement. But as I gathered my purse and prepared to say my goodbyes, Victoria stood up with her tablet in hand. There was something different about her posture, a confidence that hadn't been there earlier in the evening. "Actually," she said, her young voice cutting through the adult conversations around the table, "before everyone leaves, I have something I'd like to share with you all." The entire table turned to look at Victoria as she stood there with her tablet, a 16-year-old girl commanding the attention of 23 adults. There was something in her bearing that reminded me of myself at that age, determined, unafraid to speak the truth, even when it made others uncomfortable. Stephanie's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, how sweet! Victoria wants to share something with the family. What is it, honey? A school project?" The condescension in her voice was unmistakable, but Victoria didn't flinch. Instead, she looked directly at me, and I saw something in her eyes that gave me the first spark of hope I'd felt all evening. "Actually, it's about Grandma Linda," Victoria said, her voice steady and clear. "I've been doing some research tonight because I was curious about something." She glanced around the table, making eye contact with each family member before continuing. "You see, I kept hearing about how Grandma's cooking is old-fashioned and outdated, how professional chefs are so much better, how we need to evolve and move on from family traditions." My heart began to race. I had no idea what Victoria had discovered, but the determined set of her jaw told me it was significant. "So I started wondering," she continued, "if Grandma's cooking was really as amateur as some people seem to think. Why do I keep finding things like this?" She held up her tablet and began to read in a clear, strong voice that carried across the suddenly silent banquet hall. "Dear Mrs. Morrison, I hope this letter finds you well. My name is James Chen, and I am the executive chef at Le Bernardin in New York City. I am writing to formally request permission to feature your family's osso buco recipe in our upcoming cookbook, Heritage Techniques, Traditional Recipes That Shaped Modern Cuisine." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt my mouth fall open in shock. Le Bernardin, one of the most prestigious restaurants in the world, wanted one of my recipes. But Victoria wasn't finished. She scrolled to something else on her tablet. "This one's from last month," she said. "Dear Linda Morrison, I am reaching out from the James Beard Foundation to invite you to be featured in our upcoming documentary series about America's culinary matriarchs. Your influence on regional Italian-American cuisine has been brought to our attention by several prominent chefs who credit your techniques with inspiring their own approaches to traditional cooking." I stared at Victoria, unable to process what I was hearing. The James Beard Foundation knew who I was. Prominent chefs had been talking about my cooking. Stephanie's face had gone pale, but she tried to maintain her composure. That's very nice, Victoria, but I'm sure there's some mistake." "Oh, there's no mistake," Victoria interrupted, her voice gaining strength, "because I found a lot more. Like this email from the Food Network, asking Grandma to appear on a show about family recipes that influenced American cooking. Or this letter from Bon Appetit magazine, wanting to feature her Christmas cookie techniques in their holiday issue. She looked directly at Stephanie as she continued reading. And then there's this one, which is really interesting. It's from the Culinary Institute of America, inviting Grandma to be a guest lecturer in their program about traditional cooking methods and their relevance in modern kitchens. The Culinary Institute of America, the most prestigious culinary school in the country, wanted me to teach their students. Me, the amateur home cook whose methods were supposedly outdated and irrelevant. Victoria, where did you find all these? Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. That's the really interesting part, Dad, Victoria replied, and I could hear the anger building beneath her calm exterior. I found them in Aunt Stephanie's email account, the one she shares with the family computer, where she's been automatically receiving all of Grandma's correspondence for the past 2 years. The air in the room seemed to evaporate. I watched Stephanie's face cycle through a series of emotions: surprise, fear, anger, and finally, a desperate kind of calculation. I don't know what you're talking about, Stephanie stammered. I never saw any of these messages. Really? Victoria's voice was ice cold now. Because, according to the timestamps, you've been reading them. Some of them you even responded to, declining on Grandma's behalf. Like this one from the Slow Food Foundation, where you wrote back saying that Linda Morrison was too elderly and confused to participate in their Heritage Cookbook project. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Too elderly and confused. She'd been telling the culinary world that I was senile, incompetent, unable to represent my own work. Or this one, Victoria continued relentlessly, where you told a producer from PBS that Grandma was suffering from memory problems and wouldn't be able to appear in their documentary about immigrant cooking traditions. The family sat in stunned silence as the magnitude of Stephanie's deception began to sink in. She hadn't just been dismissing my cooking to our family, she'd been systematically sabotaging my reputation in the culinary world, turning down opportunities that could have validated everything I'd spent my life building. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper, but in the silence of the banquet hall, it sounded like a shout. Why would you do this to me? Stephanie's mask finally slipped completely. Gone was the sweet, concerned daughter-in-law who just wanted the family to evolve. In her place was someone I barely recognized, cold, calculating, and utterly without remorse. Because you were holding everyone back, she said, her voice harsh with frustration. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it was to have people ask me about my famous mother-in-law? To have food critics and chefs calling the house, wanting to talk to you about recipes and traditions? It made us look like some kind of ethnic stereotype, like we were stuck in the past instead of moving forward with the times. The honesty was brutal and devastating. She hadn't been protecting me from exploitation or managing my correspondence out of concern for my well-being. She'd been ashamed of me. Ashamed of the recognition I was receiving, ashamed of the attention my cooking was attracting, ashamed that the culinary world saw value in what I represented. You were making us look backwards, she continued, her voice rising as years of resentment poured out. Every time someone would mention your cooking or ask about family recipes, it reinforced this image of us as old-fashioned immigrants who couldn't adapt to American culture. I worked hard to build a sophisticated image for this family, and you were undermining all of that with your peasant food and your sentimental stories about the old country. Peasant food. She'd reduced my life's work, my artistic expression, my way of loving my family, to peasant food. The recipes that professional chefs wanted to learn from, that culinary institutions wanted to preserve, that had been passed down through generations of women who had transformed simple ingredients into something transcendent, all of it dismissed as the embarrassing remnants of an immigrant past she wanted to erase. So you decided to speak for me, I said, finding my voice despite the tears that were threatening to overwhelm me. You decided that I was too old, too confused, too much of an embarrassment to represent myself. I was protecting this family's reputation, Stephanie shot back. Someone had to make the hard decisions about our public image. You would have said yes to everything, wouldn't you? Appeared on every cooking show, participated in every documentary, turned us into some kind of caricature of an Italian-American family. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. While Stephanie had been rejecting opportunities for me to share my knowledge with the world, She'd been filling our family gatherings with lectures about the superiority of professional cooking and modern techniques. She'd convinced my own children and grandchildren that my way of cooking was worthless, while simultaneously preventing me from proving otherwise to anyone who might have valued it. But the worst part, Victoria said, her young voice cutting through the tension like a knife, is what you told them when they kept trying to reach Grandma directly. She scrolled to another message on her tablet. This is from just 3 months ago, from a producer at the cooking channel. After Aunt Stephanie told them Grandma was too elderly to participate, they tried calling the house directly. So Stephanie sent this email. Mrs. Morrison's family has made the difficult decision to limit her contact with the outside world due to her declining mental state. We appreciate your interest, but it would be inappropriate to continue pursuing her for interviews or appearances. Declining mental state. She'd told the culinary world that I was suffering from dementia, that my own family had to protect me from exploitation because I was no longer competent to make my own decisions. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. I could see the shock and horror on my family's faces as they realized what Stephanie had done. Not just to me, but to all of us. She'd robbed us of the chance to be proud of what I'd accomplished, to celebrate the recognition I was receiving from the wider world, but more than that, she'd stolen something precious from each of them. The grandchildren who could have learned that their grandmother was respected by culinary professionals, who could have taken pride in being part of a family with a meaningful food heritage. The children who could have seen their mother's work validated and celebrated instead of dismissed and diminished. I trusted you, Michael said finally, his voice hollow with disbelief. I trusted you to help Mom navigate all this attention. I thought you were protecting her. I was protecting all of us, Stephanie insisted, but her voice lacked conviction now. You don't understand what it's like to have your family reduced to ethnic stereotypes. I was trying to help us move beyond all that provincial nonsense. Provincial nonsense, 3 words that summed up everything Stephanie thought about me, about my cooking, about the traditions I'd spent my life preserving. In her mind, I wasn't a woman who had created something beautiful and meaningful. I was an embarrassment to be managed, a problem to be solved, a relic to be hidden away before anyone important could see. But Victoria wasn't finished with her revelations. She had one more thing to share, and from the look on her face, it was going to be the most devastating of all. Victoria held her tablet closer to her chest, and I could see her hands trembling slightly. Whatever she was about to reveal was clearly the most difficult part of this entire confrontation. The family sat in stunned silence, still processing the magnitude of what they'd already learned about Stephanie's deception. There's one more thing, Victoria said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Something that happened just last week that made me start investigating all of this. She looked directly at me, and I saw tears beginning to form in her eyes. Grandma, do you remember when you gave me your recipe box 3 months ago? You said you wanted me to have it, to carry on the family traditions? I nodded, remembering that bittersweet afternoon when I'd finally accepted that none of my other grandchildren seemed interested in learning to cook. Victoria had been the only one who still asked questions about ingredients and techniques, who seemed to understand that the recipes weren't just instructions for making food. They were family history written in measurements and methods. Well, I've been trying to recreate some of your dishes, Victoria continued. Not because I thought they were outdated or anything, but because I wanted to feel connected to our family's story. Last week, I made your osso buco for my boyfriend's family dinner. She paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. His father is a food critic for the city paper. After he tasted it, he asked me where the recipe came from. When I told him it was my grandmother's, he got really excited and asked if he could interview you for an article he was writing about home cooks who influenced local cuisine. My heart sank as I realized where this story was heading. Another opportunity, another chance for recognition that had somehow been derailed. So I gave him your contact information, Victoria said, her voice growing stronger with anger. But when he called the house, Aunt Stephanie answered. She told him that you were in a nursing home now, that you had Alzheimer's, and couldn't remember your own recipes anymore, let alone give interviews about them. The gasp that went around the table was audible. Alzheimer's. Stephanie had told a food critic that I had Alzheimer's disease, that I was so far gone I couldn't even remember the recipes I'd been making for decades. She what? Michael's voice was barely controlled fury. That's not even the worst part, Victoria continued, and I couldn't imagine what could be worse than telling people I had dementia. When he expressed sympathy and asked if there was anything he could do to help, she suggested that he interview her instead. She told him that she'd been the one really doing all the cooking for the past few years, that she'd learned all of Grandma's techniques and could share them better than Grandma could in her current condition. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Stephanie had not only been preventing me from receiving recognition for my work, she'd been positioning herself to receive that recognition instead. She'd been erasing me so completely that she could step into my place and claim my life's work as her own. "You tried to steal my recipes?" I whispered, staring at Stephanie in complete disbelief. "I was trying to preserve them," Stephanie said defensively, but her voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. "Someone needed to make sure they were properly documented before—" "Before what?" Michael interrupted, his face flushed with anger. "Before you convinced everyone that Mom was too senile to remember them herself?" Well, the transformation in my son was remarkable. For years, he'd been completely under Stephanie's influence, nodding along with her criticisms of my cooking and her plans to modernize the family. But hearing that she'd been telling strangers that I had Alzheimer's seemed to break whatever spell she'd cast over him. "You told a food critic that my mother has dementia," he said, his voice rising with each word. "You were going to let him publish an article saying that she can't remember her own recipes. And then you were going to take credit for her work?" "It wasn't like that," Stephanie protested, but she was backing down now, no longer the confident woman who had dominated the evening's conversations. "I was just trying to make sure the recipes didn't get lost. Linda is getting older, and someone needs to be responsible for preserving family traditions." By lying about her mental state? Sarah had found her voice now, and she was angrier than I'd seen her in years. "By making people think she's in a nursing home with Alzheimer's? That's not preserving traditions, Stephanie. That's stealing them." I watched my daughter-in-law's face as the full weight of her family's fury began to register. For 3 years, she'd been able to manipulate them by positioning herself as the voice of progress, and me as an obstacle to their advancement. But the revelation that she'd been lying to the outside world about my mental state had crossed a line that even her most loyal supporters couldn't ignore. "You made us ashamed of our own grandmother," Tyler said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. "All this time, you've been telling us that her cooking was embarrassing, that her traditions were holding us back. But she's been getting recognition from famous chefs and culinary schools, and you've been hiding it from us." I looked at my grandson, this young man who had dismissed my cooking as too heavy and old-fashioned just hours earlier, and saw genuine remorse in his eyes. He was beginning to understand what had been stolen from all of us, not just me. "Do you know what it feels like," he continued, "to find out that your grandmother is respected by professional chefs while you've been treating her like she doesn't know what she's doing? That restaurants in New York City want her recipes while you've been convincing us that takeout is superior to anything she could make?" The other grandchildren were nodding along, their faces showing a mixture of guilt and anger as they realized how completely they'd been manipulated. Emma was crying openly now, and even my youngest grandson, who had barely acknowledged my presence all evening, was looking at me with something that might have been awe. "I want to read one more thing," Victoria said, her voice steadying as she scrolled through her tablet. "This is from a cookbook editor at a major publishing house. It's dated 6 months ago." She cleared her throat and began reading. "Dear Mrs. Morrison, I hope this letter finds you in good health. I am writing to propose a cookbook project that would feature your family recipes alongside the stories behind them. We believe there is significant market interest in authentic Italian-American cuisine with a personal narrative component. Based on the recommendations we've received from culinary professionals familiar with your work, we are prepared to offer you a substantial advance for this project." A cookbook. A major publisher had wanted to produce a cookbook of my recipes, complete with the family stories that gave them meaning. It was everything I'd ever dreamed of. A way to preserve our traditions in a form that could be passed down to future generations. A validation of everything I'd spent my life creating. "The advance they offered," Victoria continued, looking directly at Stephanie, "was for $50,000. The number hung in the air like an accusation. $50,000. Not just for the recipes themselves, but for the stories that went with them, the family history that Stephanie had dismissed as provincial nonsense. You cost her $50,000. Michael said flatly, staring at his wife with an expression I'd never seen before. You cost our family a cookbook that could have preserved Mom's recipes forever. You cost my children the chance to see their grandmother's work valued and celebrated. And you cost Grandma the recognition she deserved, Victoria added, her young voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority, all because you were ashamed of where we came from. The truth of Victoria's words settled over the table like a shroud. This hadn't been about protecting me or helping the family evolve. This had been about Stephanie's deep shame regarding our heritage, her desperate need to distance herself and, by extension, all of us from anything that marked us as different, ethnic, immigrant. She'd seen my cooking not as an art form or an expression of love, but as evidence of our failure to fully assimilate into mainstream American culture. Every recipe was a reminder of our Italian roots, every tradition a mark of our otherness in her vision of sophisticated modern life. I never meant for it to go this far, Stephanie said finally, her voice small and defeated. I just wanted us to fit in better, to be seen as successful Americans, not as some kind of ethnic curiosity. So you tried to erase the very thing that made us special, Sarah said softly. You tried to make us ordinary. The conversation that followed was painful and necessary. One by one, my children and grandchildren began to share their own memories of the traditions Stephanie had convinced them to abandon. Tyler talked about missing the Sunday cooking sessions where he'd learned to make pasta from scratch. Emma remembered the Christmas cookie baking marathons and how empty the holidays had felt without them. Even Michael admitted that he'd never enjoyed the catered meals and restaurant dinners as much as the chaotic, love-filled gatherings in my kitchen. They talked about feeling disconnected from their heritage, about losing the sense of family identity that had once centered around our shared meals. They realized that in their effort to become more sophisticated, they'd given up something precious that money couldn't buy back. As for me, I sat quietly and listened to my family rediscover the value of what had nearly been lost forever. The recipes could be recreated, the traditions could be restored, but the years of feeling invisible and unwanted couldn't be undone. The damage Stephanie had inflicted went deeper than missed opportunities or intercepted correspondence. She'd made me doubt the worth of everything I'd dedicated my life to creating, but as I looked around the table at the faces of people I loved, seeing genuine remorse and newfound appreciation in their eyes, I began to feel something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. Hope that we could find our way back to each other. Victoria still had her tablet in her hands, and I had a feeling she wasn't quite finished with her revelations yet. Victoria set her tablet down on the table and looked directly at me with an expression that was both determined and gentle. Grandma, there's one last thing I need to tell you. Something I did this afternoon, before we came here tonight. I held my breath, not sure I could handle any more revelations. The emotional weight of the evening had already exceeded anything I could have imagined, but Victoria's tone suggested that whatever came next would be different from the devastating exposures that had preceded it. After I found all those emails and letters, I realized that Aunt Stephanie had been responding to people for almost 2 years, always declining on your behalf. But I also realized that some of these opportunities might still be available if people knew the truth about your situation. She picked up her tablet again, but this time her expression was hopeful rather than angry. So I took the liberty of sending a few emails myself. I explained that there had been a miscommunication, that you were in perfect health, and very much interested in sharing your culinary knowledge with the world. My heart began to race. What had this brave young woman done? The first response came back within an hour, Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger with excitement. It was from the James Beard Foundation. They said they would be delighted to reschedule the interview for their documentary series. They're still very interested in featuring you as one of America's culinary matriarchs. I felt tears beginning to form in my eyes. The James Beard Foundation still wanted to interview me, even after Stephanie had tried to close that door permanently. Then the Culinary Institute of America responded, Victoria said, practically glowing now. They not only want you to be a guest lecturer, but they're offering to create a scholarship program in your name for students studying traditional cooking techniques. A scholarship program in my name, at the most prestigious culinary school in the country. I couldn't quite process the magnitude of what Victoria was telling me. But the best one, she said, her voice trembling with emotion, came from that publisher who wanted to do your cookbook. When I explained what had happened, they said the offer is still open. In fact, they're even more interested now because they think the story of how your recipes were nearly lost makes the project even more compelling. She reached across the table and took my hand. Grandma, they want to publish your cookbook. They want to preserve your recipes and the stories behind them for future generations. They want to make sure that what happened to our family, losing touch with our heritage, doesn't happen to other families. I couldn't speak. For 3 years, I'd felt like I was disappearing, becoming irrelevant to my own family and invisible to the wider world. Now I was learning that the culinary community had been trying to celebrate and preserve my work all along, and that there were still people who understood the value of what I represented. "There's more," Victoria said softly. "That food critic I mentioned, the one who tasted my osso buco, when I explained the real situation, he asked if he could write a different kind of article. Not just about your recipes, but about the importance of preserving family food traditions and the damage that can be done when people become ashamed of their heritage." She looked around the table at our family, many of whom were crying openly now. "He wants to interview all of us about what we lost when we stopped cooking together and what we're hoping to rebuild." The transformation in the room was remarkable. The sterile banquet hall that had felt so cold and impersonal earlier in the evening now seemed filled with warmth and possibility. My family, who had spent years drifting away from the traditions that had once bound us together, were beginning to remember who we used to be. Michael was the first to speak. "Mom, I owe you an apology that I don't know how to begin to make." His voice was thick with emotion. "I let Stephanie convince me that your way of doing things was holding us back, that we needed to evolve beyond our family traditions. I was so focused on fitting in, on being successful in the way I thought mattered, that I forgot what actually made our family special." He looked around the table at his children, who were listening with rapt attention. "I forgot that the Sunday dinners weren't just about food, they were about connection, about taking time to be together, to share stories, to pass down something meaningful from one generation to the next." Sarah nodded through her tears. "I remember being so proud when I was little and people would compliment your cooking, Mom. I used to brag to my friends about my grandmother's recipes. When did I stop feeling that way? When did I start seeing our traditions as something to be embarrassed about?" "When someone convinced us that being American meant giving up everything that came before," Tyler said quietly. "But I've been thinking about it since Victoria started reading those letters, and I realized that the most American thing of all is supposed to be celebrating where we came from while building something new." Emma, who had been relatively quiet throughout the evening, suddenly spoke up. "Grandma, would you teach me to make your Christmas cookies again? I know I said they were too much work, but I miss them. The holidays haven't felt the same without them." One by one, my grandchildren began asking about specific recipes, specific traditions they wanted to learn or relearn. The enthusiasm in their voices reminded me of when they were small, and would beg to help in the kitchen, getting flour in their hair and sauce on their clothes while we created something beautiful together. Even as joy began to fill my heart, I was acutely aware of Stephanie sitting in silence at the other end of the table. She hadn't spoken since the revelations about her deception had been fully exposed, and I could see the isolation settling around her like a wall. For all the pain she had caused me, I found myself feeling something unexpected. "Pity, Stephanie," I said quietly, drawing everyone's attention. The room fell silent as they waited to see how I would address the woman who had tried to erase me from my own family. She looked up at me with eyes that were red-rimmed and desperate. "Linda, you were ashamed of us," I said simply. "Ashamed of where we came from. Ashamed of the traditions that made us who we are. You saw my cooking as evidence that we hadn't successfully assimilated, and you wanted to erase that evidence." She nodded miserably, unable to deny the truth of what I was saying. "But here's what you never understood," I continued, my voice growing stronger. "Being Italian-American doesn't make us less American. Preserving our food traditions doesn't mean we're stuck in the past. Creating something beautiful with our hands doesn't make us primitive or unsophisticated." I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of 72 years and the accumulated pain of the past 3, but also feeling something else, the return of my own dignity. "What you tried to destroy, our connection to our heritage, our pride in our family's story, Those are the things that actually make us stronger. They give us roots, identity, something meaningful to pass down to future generations. I looked around at my family, these people I had loved and nourished for decades, who were finally remembering the value of what we had shared. I forgive you, Stephanie, because holding on to anger would only poison what we're trying to rebuild. But I want you to understand something. You didn't just hurt me these past 3 years. You hurt all of us by convincing us to be ashamed of something beautiful. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It felt like the quiet that comes after a storm, when the air is finally clear and you can see the landscape that was always there, just temporarily obscured. Victoria reached for her tablet one more time. Actually, Grandma, there's one more thing. I sent an email to everyone in the family. All the cousins, the aunts and uncles, even some of the family friends who used to come to your Sunday dinners. I told them what we learned tonight and invited them to a special dinner next Sunday. She smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like the little girl who used to sneak cookie dough from my mixing bowls. I thought maybe we could start over, have a real family dinner, the kind where everyone helps cook and we take our time and remember what it feels like to be together. The response from around the table was immediate and enthusiastic. Everyone wanted to be part of rebuilding what had been lost. They wanted to learn the recipes they'd forgotten, hear the stories they'd dismissed, reconnect with the heritage they'd been taught to abandon. As we began making plans for the following Sunday, who would bring what, which recipes we'd tackle together, how we'd organize the cooking so everyone could participate, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the deep satisfaction of being needed, valued, central to my family's happiness. The cookbook would be written, the interviews would be given. The culinary world would have the chance to learn from and preserve the traditions that had been passed down through generations of women in my family. But more important than any external recognition was this: my family was coming home. As we prepared to leave the banquet hall that night, Victoria linked her arm through mine. Grandma, I have one more surprise for you. She pulled out her phone and showed me a social media page she'd created. It was called Nonna Linda's Kitchen and was filled with photos of the dishes I'd made over the years, stories about our family traditions, and posts about the importance of preserving culinary heritage. I started it this afternoon, she said proudly. It already has 300 followers and people are sharing their own family food stories in the comments. I think we're going to help a lot of families remember what they've been missing. As I looked at the screen filled with comments from strangers who understood the value of what we were trying to preserve, I realized that the pain of the past 3 years had led to something I never could have anticipated. Not just the restoration of my place in my own family, but the opportunity to help other families avoid the mistake we had made. Food is love made visible. It always had been, and it always would be. Tomorrow, I would begin the work of making sure that truth would never be forgotten again. The legacy that Stephanie had tried to deny wasn't just about recipes or cooking techniques. It was about the understanding that when we gather around a table to share food prepared with love, we're participating in something sacred, something that connects us to our past, grounds us in the present, and creates memories that will nourish future generations long after the last dish has been cleared away.